I know that people are still kind of wandering in from after the last lecture, but I think we ought to start now. I'd very much like to welcome and introduce Laura Mulvey, who's going to give this evening's lecture entitled The Index and the Uncanny, which will reflect on certain aspects about the photographic image, the moving image, and the rise of virtual reality, as opposed to what we have at the AA, which is virtual morality. Laura is probably known to many of you as a distinguished film theorist and filmmaker whose writings have been extremely influential from the 70s in opening up the whole field of feminist film analysis. She is currently running the postgraduate film program at the BFI and is responsible for the BFI teaching contribution, together with Colin McCabe, to the London Consortium, to which the Architectural Association belongs. As a writer, she is the author of 2 collections of essays, Visual and Other Pleasures, and Fetishism and Curiosity, together with the text on Citizen Kane as part of the BFI series on great movies. She also composed the commentary to the Laserdisc of Peeping Tom, and co-directed 6 films with Peter Wallen in the 70s and 80s, and recently made the film Disgraced Monuments with Mark Lewis, which was shown here and made originally for Channel 4. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Laura to speak again at the AA.
I know that one shouldn't apologize before starting a lecture, but without any apologies, I would also like to say that this piece is a piece that Mark, why didn't you move my bags away then? It's more room. Yeah. Thanks very much. That this is a piece that I've been working on for an inordinately long time, and I still am working on it. And I can't quite figure out precisely what I want to do with it, and it keeps having different endings. The ending that I was going to show you today is not going to happen because, as Mark would probably point out, that due to some unconscious impulse, I lost my slides. So you're going to have a different kind of ending, though I might sketch in the one that I would have given to you. One of the reasons for doing this paper, which I don't think is really visible so much as I go through it until perhaps towards the end, is that I've been working, as Mark pointed out, on film theory, and particularly with ideas of feminist film theory and psychoanalytic theory, since the early 70s. And I've been trying to think through to myself about how my priorities might change, how my sense of the priorities that are demanded by a particular moment in time and history might change. And perhaps out of that, I've found that I've been thinking back into questions of history, which aren't present so much in this paper today, but also, as well, thinking a little bit, in a rather superficial way, about the kinds of technological changes that we're seeing in modes of representation at the moment. So, my starting point has been questions that one sees raised constantly in theoretical articles, as well actually as just journalistic articles in the press, about what happens to one's sense of the photosensitive image, the images produced by photosensitive material. What's their destiny? What's their fate in the epoch of digital imagery? Now, it's not really the future or the questions of the digital that I'm addressing as yet. I might try in the future. At the moment, I've been considering more the way in which a new configuration, a new series of questions about perception and representation might affect one's sense of one's assumptions, one's idées reçues, one's about perception and representations of photography and film as based on celluloid. So my thoughts tonight are more retrospective than moving ahead, more moving back than moving ahead. And in a way, to make this point of going back to origins, rethinking from origins, I wanted to start off this evening by showing you two very, very short pieces of film made by the two pioneers of the moving image, the Lumiere brothers and Gustave Melies. Has anyone here, could I just see a show of hands, has anyone here not seen footage by the Lumiere brothers? Some people haven't. And has anyone not seen footage by Georges Méliès, the magician? A few people, right. Now, my aim in showing you these two little bits of film is to argue by the end of this talk that one could perhaps change around, turn upside down the cliché assumptions that have been invested in an opposition between the two, which has haunted the cinema since its very earliest days. And this cliché opposition became enshrined as a value judgment when the rump of the surrealist movement in the 1950s headed two columns divided their views of cinema into two columns, one headed by the name Lumiere, and figured don't see, and the other Méliès figured see. And of course the Lumieres stand and have been seen to stand for, and were understood by the surrealists to stand for realism, pure and simple, everything that the surrealists stood against. Whereas, on the other hand, Méliès used the illusion of movement that the Lumieres had invented in order to create a parallel supernatural world of magic and marvelous effects. Now, I want to show you these two little pieces, and then, as I say, my aim, after quite a long detour through this talk, will be to question the opposition that's set up quite so simply there. Could we just see, its first actually is unchronologically, is Méliès.
first, the Lumiere company made their film 50-foot length. When the film came to an end, so did the team.
Okay, that's it. Okay, I'm going to leave the discussion of those two pieces of film until later on. And I now just want to start with pointing out the way in which film theory, the kind of film theory that I emerged out of and that I worked with, really defined itself in opposition to a realist aesthetic. And by using semiotics and psychoanalytic theory, and feminist theory picking up on semiotics and psychoanalysis, we attempted at the time to show that the realist representation of the image was actually purely an illusion, and in order to get into its meaning, you had to break down well, the surface appearance of the film and understand its materiality, how it was produced, and the way in which meaning was created. And tonight, I want to try and use some of the theoretical tools and the theoretical ideas that influenced me in the past to make a rather different kind of argument, returning to the question of the referentiality in the photographic image and think how one might redefine it in the context of the new configurations that I mentioned earlier. I think that the intervening 25 or so years since film theory began to develop have seen such enormous changes in economics, technology, politics, that whatever conclusion one might come to, it's an actual necessity to re-examine one's theories in the light of historic, cultural, and economic, technological, etc. change. And if we could say that yesterday's intellectuals demonstrated quite convincingly that the photographic medium's much acclaimed truth and evidential theory was quite illusory, today's intellectuals are now facing the implications of the digital technological revolution that I mentioned earlier, in which the question of reference is no longer even at issue. So the question is the reference, the referentiality of the image now an issue in a way that perhaps 20 years ago it seemed not to be so. Now, we could respond to this situation by welcoming the change and just saying that the fact that the referential value of the photographic image needn't be debated any longer, and all those long and tedious debates about evidence and truth can now be short-circuited. And we can think of photography as being restored, perhaps, to a kind of painterliness and subjectivity which it's been deprived of in the past. But on the other hand, we might also think that in a world economy where the visual image is becoming a currency for investment and is an area in which the most intense capital expansion is taking place, visual imagery and its status in the world still actually has questions that it should continue to put to us. And I don't think this would be to fetishize the issue, but actually rather just to redress a balance that seems to have lost equilibrium in intellectual and aesthetic debates of the past 20 years or so. And I just wanted to finish this introduction by quoting from David Roderick, a theorist who's reflected on and speculated about the place of the digital in our present understanding of representation and so on, who says, when Walter Benjamin announced the era of mechanical reproduction 50 years ago, he knew critical theory stood at a political crossroads. New technologies of the visible yield new procedures of expression, and along with them, new potentials for either reification or liberation. And then Roderick comments, on the threshold of the figural era, we are now facing the same ethical choices. Now, I'm not in this paper dealing with this question of ethical choices, and as I said earlier, my perspective is more retrospective, looking backwards rather than looking forward. And I want to go back to think about the way in which those issues might affect our understanding of images that come from the photosensitive material. Okay, now I've organized the next section of my talk around a number of headings. So what I'll try and do is kind of announce the headings and then kind of link them back as I get on to another one. Now, and my first heading is called the index. Now, as you probably all know, the index was the semiotic category elaborated by Charles Sanders Peirce, which defines the referential aspect of the sign. And the idea of the index emphasizes the materiality of certain signs which are created from an indexical process. And the example that's always given is the example of a fingerprint, which is, in a sense, the object itself, which creates the sign, which is then left behind as a representation of the finger. But there is actually a material link between the sign that's left and the object that's made it. So reference in this case is not based on resemblance, but on presence, on the presence of the object. In Peirce's next category of sign, the iconic, the sign achieves its meaning and its significance by, indeed, resemblance. It resembles the object that it represents, and it can be recognized because it literally looks like that object. We can literally recognize it through similarity. So both the indexical and the iconic aspects of the sign in Peirce's terms may relate to a given pre-existing reality, but not in the same way. But the indexicality of the image, the fact that it's created by a material imprint, hovers over the iconicity in order to give it some guarantee of its reference. Okay, now I'm going to link this, the indexical aspect of the sign, to arguments around the indexicality of the still photograph. So this paragraph is the index and the still photograph. The still photograph has often been characterized in terms of its indexicality. And Roland Barthes, as probably a lot of you know, has described the photographic process as produced by, and this is a quotation, a photosensitive material which made it possible to recover and print directly the luminous rays emitted from a lighted object. And he says that in spite of all possible human interference, it is this characteristic that differentiates photography from other forms of representation. He says, it is as if the photograph always carries the referent within itself. And Rosalind Krauss makes a very similar point. She says, The photographic sign bears a connection to the thing it represents by having been caused physically by its referent. The index is the only sign which carries the trace of its referent, its origin, in the physical process of imprinting within it, within itself. Now, I want to juxtapose those Krauss-Barthes points from an article by Bazin called The Ontology of the Photographic Image, which he wrote at some point early in the 50s. I can't remember the exact date. And Bazin is summarizing the history of the human creative instinct. And in a very few pages, he argues for the photograph's indexicality. Writing when he doesn't use the term index, but he then does say, the photograph as such and the object itself share a common being after the fashion of a fingerprint. Wherefore, photography actually contributes something to the order of natural creation instead of substituting for it. And he goes on, all the arts are based on the presence of man. Only photography derives an advantage from its absence. Photography affects us like a phenomenon of nature, like a flower or a snowflake whose vegetable and earthly origins are an inseparable part of their beauty. So this natural beauty that Bazin, as a Catholic phenomenologist, sees in the indexical aspect of the photographic image leads implicitly on to his theories of the moving image, his support for Rossellini's realism, for Wells and Renoir's deep focus. Now, to stay for the time being with the question of the still photograph, from the index to the still photograph, I want to go to the questions of time in the still photograph and time. The fact that light inscribes the object onto the photosensitive paper at a particular moment, that is, its very indexicality, is not only an inscription of the object, but of the object at a particular moment of time, which is henceforth suspended. And although Bazin, once again, doesn't draw specific attention to the issue, the problem of time as an effect of the indexical process is there running through his comments and his reflections in his ontology essay. He says, the photographic image is the object itself, the object freed from the conditions of time and space which govern it. No matter how fuzzy, distorted, or discolored, no matter how lacking in documentary value the image may be, it, the photographic image, shares, by virtue of the very process of becoming, the being of the model of which it is the reproduction. It is the model. Hence the charm of family albums, those grey or sepia shadows, phantom-like and almost indecipherable, are no longer traditional family portraits, but rather the disturbing presence of lives halted at a set moment in their duration and freed from their destiny. Not, however, by the prestige of art, but by the power of an impassive mechanical process. For photography does not simply photography does not create eternity as art does. It embalms time, rescuing it simply from its own proper corruption. Now, Barthes gives a further dimension to this sense of embalmed time when he reflects in Camera Lucida. My points from Barthes, as you probably recognize, come from his book Camera Lucida. He reflects on the problem of the photograph's tense, its possible place in a grammatical system. Barthes argues that the photographic image records an absence of an object or a person that was once in front of the camera, while also recording that former presence. And he calls this the that has been of photography. This is Barthes. Now, in the photograph, what I posit is not only the absence of the object, it is also, by one and the same movement, on equal terms, the fact is that this is where the madness is. The photograph is a bizarre medium, a new form of hallucination, false on the level of perception, but true on the level of time. It's a temporal hallucination, so to speak, a modest, shared hallucination. On the one hand, it is not there, but on the other hand, it has indeed been there. Anne Banfield, discussing Barthes' observation on this question of time's immobilization in the photograph, comments further on the difficulty of ascribing an actual tense to it. She says, "This now in the past can be captured not by combining tenses, but by combining a past tense with a present time deictic. The photograph's moment was now," deictic meaning a now, then, here, there. So the instance of the photograph's moment was now an apparent grammatical contradiction. And she says, "This sight is a sight reduced to the simply seen, from whose subjective image, the this was now here, all subjectivity that requires a subject, an I, is eliminated." And she goes on to suggest that this elimination of the subject, the subjectivity, produces a zone of silence, an area of affectless, a collapse of meaning, leaving only a sensation of an intractable reality and perhaps one's own impending death. And in Camera Lucida, of course, this ultimate collapse of meaning takes place around Barthes' reflection on his mother's photograph, its presence as life after death, accompanied by his own sense of mortality, a moment of time preserved, allied with the timelessness of death, or indeed, perhaps, the timelessness of the afterlife. Okay, my next paragraph goes on from time to life in death. Thinking of the importance of indexicality for the photograph in his ontology essay, Bazin identifies the origin of art, of the origin of the making of likenesses, as the human being's attempt to overcome death. And he traces this practice back to mummies in Egypt, and he also sees it there as present in the practice of making death masks, which he sees a prototypical example of an image that's made out of the direct imprint of the object. And he goes on to say, "Death is but the victory of time. To preserve the bodily appearance artificially is to snatch it from the flow of time, to stow it neatly away, so to speak, in the hold of life." So this process of holding back time and preserving the actual features of the dead person through an imprinted image would be realized, to Bazin's way of thinking, finally and perfectly with the photograph and photography. So photography would then take over a function that art had struggled to fulfill for thousands of years. But there's another dimension to Bazin's argument, which is really a kind of intuitive footnote. It's just there as a footnote, an intuitive aside in a footnote. He then says, "One should really examine the psychology of relics and souvenirs, which likewise enjoy the advantages of a transfer of reality stemming from the mummy complex. Let us merely note in passing that the Holy Shroud of Turin combines the features alike of relic and photograph." And then Barthes, from a very different aesthetic and intellectual perspective, makes this observation, in which he seems to be following a rather similar train of thought. He says, "The photograph does not call up the past. There's nothing Proustian about the photograph. The effect it produces in me is not to restore what has been abolished by time and distance, but to attest that what I see has indeed existed. Now, this is a strictly scandalous effect. Always the photograph astonishes me with an astonishment that endures and renews itself inexhaustibly. Perhaps this astonishment, this persistence, reaches down into the religious substance out of which I am molded. Nothing for it. Photography has something to do with the resurrection. Might we not say, as the Byzantines said of the image of Christ, which impregnated St. Veronica's napkin, that it was not made by the hand of man? And of course, St. Veronica's napkin is the origin of the Shroud of Turin. And this theme continues more explicitly with Barthes' reflections on death and the photograph. Of course, a considerable amount of the reflections in Camera Lucida are around and about the photograph of his mother, which had been taken when she was a young girl. So his recently deceased mother, which was taken when she was a young girl. So these reflections are not only about the that has been, which is subject to the passing of time within the course of life, but it's also the presence of an absence which goes through a sea change after death. So either a known and mourned death or the presumed death of an unknown person who might be found in an old photograph. And Barthes says that in every photograph there is that rather terrible thing, the return of the dead. He goes on, all those young photographers who are at work in the world, determined upon the capture of actuality, do not know that they are the agents of the capture of death. Photography must have some historical relation with what Edgar Morin calls the crisis of death, beginning in the second half of the 19th century. For my part, I should prefer that instead of constantly relocating the advent of photography in its social and economic context, we should inquire as to its anthropological place, as to the anthropological place of death in the new image. For death must be somewhere in a society, and if it is no longer or less intensely in religion, it must be elsewhere. Perhaps in this image, which produces death while trying to preserve life. Contemporary with the withdrawal of rights, photography may respond to the intrusion in our modern society of an asymbolic death, outside of religion, outside of ritual, a kind of abrupt dive into literal death. Life-death, the paradigm is reduced to a single click, the one separating the initial pose from the final print. So here we have Barthes' line of thought moving from the indexicality of the photograph, its inscription in and of time, to the concept of a hallucination, to the photographic image as a return of the dead, and finally he ends up with a reference to religion itself. So in the process, he actually takes the argument from the photograph as on the side of materiality, on the side of a material trace, to the photograph on the side of the supernatural. And that is from the usual and expected association between the photograph and its being there, its assertion of a once upon a time moment that once existed in the world, to the human fascination with, and even perhaps need to believe in, something that transcends death, similar perhaps to Bazin's analysis of the origins of art. Now, to my mind, this shift from the essentially material, the essential presence of the object materially there in the indexical image, to the more supernatural implications that Barthes is arguing for is actually only enabled by the indexical nature of the photographic image. It's this shift from materiality to the preservation of time, to that preservation of a single moment, then of lost time, which then holds the image of the deceased person in that moment of time for eternity, as it were. So from this point of view, it's the most material aspect, the literal link between object and image, that gives rise to what we might think of as its most elusive and its most difficult aspect. Okay, so my next section is called Life in Death, going on from my previous section of the still life in death in the still photograph to the question of the uncanny. Freud wrote a famous essay, The Uncanny, in 1919. And in this essay, he collects together a number of disparate themes, which isn't so much really, in the last resort, a theorization of his concept of the uncanny, rather than a reflection on a number of different uncanny phenomena, if you like. And throughout the essay, Freud returns to the theme of the boundary between the living and the dead, that is, between matter that's animate or inanimate. And he argues that the psychic and intellectual uncertainties arising from the apparent collapse or dissolution of boundaries between the two is a specific and identifiable source of the phenomenon that he called the uncanny. And he begins his essay with a tribute to Jentsch, his reflections on the uncanny, and it was Jentsch who introduced the question of the automaton Olympia from E.T.A. Hoffman's story, The Sandman. And he points out that not only does the beautiful doll in the story cause uncertainty as to whether it's actually living or actually dead, it's, as it were, in between the animate and the inanimate, but that the storyteller actually plays on and accentuates the uncanny effect through the formal manner in which the story is told. And Freud identifies the uncanny as the point where the essential distinction between the imagination and reality is suddenly effaced. And then the problem of death also figures in the uncanny essay. And his perspective, as we might expect, is, in the first instance, a psychoanalytic one. He says, in italics, all men are mortal, as it were, as a quotation. All men are mortal is paraded in the textbooks of logic as an example of a general proposition, but no human being really grasps it, and our unconscious has as little use now as it ever had for the idea of its own mortality. And he then mentions very much in passing the way in which the rational mind continued to be haunted in his day, and indeed until the present day as well, by fascination with phenomena of the supernatural, and particularly of life that might exist, continue to exist invisibly after death, and might make itself in some way visible. And he comments in kind of ironic spirit, in our great cities, placards announce lectures that undertake to tell us how to get in touch with the souls of the departed. And it cannot be denied that not a few of our most able and penetrating minds among contemporary men of science have come to the conclusion, especially towards the end of their own lives, that a contact of this kind with the beyond is not impossible. And then finally, he goes back to the question of the uncanny and says, are we justified in ignoring intellectual uncertainty as a factor in the uncanny, seeing that we just admitted its importance in relationship to death? So the subject's intellectual uncertainty about its own mortality then also reflects on the uncanny as a phenomenon of intellectual uncertainty as such. Okay, now I want to kind of close this circle by putting together the points that I've just made about the uncanny with the points that I started off with at the beginning about the index. So this section is the uncanny and the index. Now, under the rubric, the uncanny, Freud touches on various points, which in turn touch on the problem of the photograph's temporality, its uncertainty, and that is, the uncertainty of its relationship to time, which once again can then align the photograph itself as or with uncanny phenomena. And to go back to Bazin, his use of language in the passage that I quoted earlier indicates that for him, the photograph hovers around this area which Freud describes as the uncanny. He uses words like shadows, phantom-like, the disturbing presence of lives halted, the mechanical process which embalms time against corruption. And in addition to the photograph's ultimate uncanny presence as an inanimate object containing a trace of lived time, there's also the question of the camera as a machine, which is both part of and beyond human vision. It's the machine, that is, that records this moment. And while the machine enables the registration of the image, it's then the negative which embalms time against corruption. And the negative can then generate an endless series of positives, a near endless reproduction of likenesses, which also evokes Freud's theme of doubling as a phenomenon of the uncanny. Right, so the paradox of the photograph is caught in terms such as Barthes' use of the phrase the referential illusion, and Bazin's the hallucination that's also a fact, which link with Freud's summary of the uncanny as the moment at which the distinction between the imagination and reality is suddenly effaced, and his constant return to the theme of uncertainties, uncertainties of vision, uncertainties of the psyche, and uncertainties of understanding, those moments in which all those certainties are suddenly put into a moment of crisis. And this sensation of uncanniness depends in the first instance on perception, on the sight of something which is perceived in a flash, like the experience of a trompe-l'oeil. And while this sensation might be there in Barthes' awareness of that has been, the presence of the indexical sign, that is, this moment of perception also has an emotional impact, which arises from that moment of perception giving rise to something more. And Barthes describes being emotionally touched by the unpredictable detail of the photograph, of an object or of a person or a place, which he, as is well known, calls the punctum. He said, "It is what I add to the photograph, but it is nonetheless already there. It is acute yet muffled. It cries out in silence. It's an odd contradiction. It's a floating flash." And here, the consciousness of the indexical moment, that flash of perception of the that has been that's preserved in the photograph, then fuses with, but is separate from the emotion, the moment in which the psyche is touched by some detail of the person or the object. Now, it seems to me that one could take this argument about indexicality on to certain questions about reality. What is reality, and what is the reality of the photograph? The punctum is Barthes' means of describing something which is beyond words, not just because it may be actually unspeakable, because it touches on some aspect of the human mind that's outside language. And in Barthes' words, he says he refers back to Lacan's concept of the real, the encounter, the occasion. And in Harold Foster's article, The Return of the Real, he takes up this question of Barthes' punctum as a moment of rupture in the subject that takes place between the perception and the consciousness of a subject when suddenly touched by something in the image. And Foster tries to argue for a traumatic point which represents a missed encounter with the real, but at the same time a sensation that the real might indeed be there. So in Lacan, the real is material close to the unconscious mind, in fact so close to the unconscious mind that it is outside symbolization, evades representation, and remains outside language. And it's, I suppose, the function, and Mark, I'm sure, can correct me if I'm wrong, the function of social and cultural institutions to allow the psyche to negotiate itself out of the real as a specific concept and into this much more amorphous sense of reality within which we can exist in a much more comfortable state of mind. Now, Anne Banfield, in her discussion of Camera Lucida, the Barthes book, goes further into this question of the photograph's relationship to a temporal grammar. Sorry. And she emphasizes the impossibility of going beyond the absence of meaning, the zone of silence, which, sorry, let me just try and get this again because I've got confused. She is arguing that the photograph's relation to a temporal grammar, to time, emphasizes the impossibility of going beyond its absence of meaning, beyond its zone of silence, which can only be mitigated in her terms by the words here, now, then, there, which she feels the photograph uses to negotiate its temporality rather than the sophistication of tense. And these terms can only indicate around a narrow placing of the image in time and space, and which varies, of course, according to the time and place from which they're uttered. She says, something in the image revealed by the photograph leads one to confront in it the awakening of an intractable reality. Now, finally, I want to say something about the cinema. The cinema, as it has existed from the very earliest days, from the first experiments of the Lumiere brothers, right through to the way in which most of us experience it today when we go to the cinema, is a series of still images on a celluloid strip. That isn't the case here with our video technology, but if you can imagine what the cinema consists of, it's a strip of celluloid with a series of stills on it. And so each one of these stills, as it were, shares the attributes of the uncanny, which I've been trying to discuss in terms of the still photograph itself. So each of these stills has those uncanny attributes. But when the strip of film is run through the projecting machine, through the projector, these still images come to life as they're projected according to the speed which our eyes, our vision need in order to achieve the illusion of movement that seems to be like the way in which we perceive movement in ordinary, everyday reality. So, in that sense, the still image comes to life in the cinema. So that relationship between the animate and the inanimate is then reconfigured in another way. The inanimate stillness of the celluloid strip then is animated and comes to life, or to the illusion of life, as the projector starts turning them around. And then at the same time, we could take this further and think of the way in which the cinema itself, too, preserves the images of the dead. So, in a double sense, is animating the inanimate. Not only does it animate the celluloid strip, but is giving the illusion of life to people who may indeed be long dead. And this is where I just want to give one more quotation from Barthes. Sorry. Right. When Barthes comes to comment on cinema, he says, "The cinema is objectivity in time. The film is no longer content to preserve the object, enshrouded, as it were, in an instant, as the bodies of insects are preserved intact out of the past in amber. Now, for the first time, the image of things is likewise the image of their duration, change, mummified, as it were." So, as we see these images of the inanimate reanimated by the cinema machine, we can think of these endlessly repeated movements, both real and mechanical, as mummified change. And then, as Godard said in a very famous phrase when asked what is the cinema, said, "Cinema is death 24 times a second," as the frame has to move through the projector 24 times in order to create the illusion of movement. So there, in that neat phrase, he's bringing in this kind of oscillation between animation, the animate and the inanimate, which is very much there at the core of the cinema itself. And in a passage going from Godard right back to the beginnings of the cinema, Maxime Gorky described his reaction to the cinema, the Lumiere cinematograph, when he was writing from Paris for a Russian newspaper in 1896. And he says, "Yesterday I was in the kingdom of the shadows." And he described seeing a photographic image projected as a still on a screen, which was a custom in those days. And then suddenly, as the projector began to move, he says, "Suddenly a strange flicker passes across the screen and the picture comes to life." He says, "It's terrifying to watch, but it is the movement of shadows, mere shadows, curses and ghosts, evil spirits that have cast whole cities into eternal sleep come to mind, and you feel as though Merlin's vicious trick had been played out before you. It is as if he had cast a spell on the entire street." Now, the cinema that Bazin loved was one, as I said earlier, the cinema which he saw as represented par excellence by Rossellini, a cinema in which mummified change would, he thought, be perceptible to the spectator. That sense of the presence of the recording moment, he thought, would be there in the beauty of the film, would be there inscribed in the process of registration, and would include the arbitrary presence of natural and unpredictable elements. And a camera which would allow the process of indexical inscription to be visible rather than cover over that process of indexicality with illusion and smother it with an excess of fiction, so So Bazin wasn't, in a sense, opposed to fiction, but he felt that that moment of the coming into being of the cinematic image should be there for people to be aware of, meditate on, and reflect on. Now for Barthes, perhaps following the same line of thought, but from a greater extreme, felt very strongly that fiction kills the presence of trace that has been, which is there in the still photograph. So he says, society is concerned to tame the photograph, to temper the madness which keeps threatening to explode in the face of whoever looks at it. To do this, it possesses two means. And first he talks about how photography as art domesticates it. The cinema, then his second point, the cinema participates in this domestication of photography, at least the fictional cinema, precisely the one said to be the seventh art. A film can be mad by artifice, can present the cultural signs of madness, but it is never mad by nature. It is always the very opposite of a hallucination. It is simply an illusion. Its vision is oneric, not probably. I think I'll have to leave a dots over that. Ekmnesic. Anyway, the important point here, sorry, I read that aloud, but I've actually got no idea what it means. Yeah. But I think the point that's important here is that for Barthes, fiction creates an illusion which precisely destroys what he calls the madness of the photograph, the presence of time, the presence of the index, the presence of death, and the kinds of connotations that go with it. Right, now I'm beginning to come to the end. I wanted just to say something about the way in which the phenomenon of uncanniness is not one which is, in any sense, stable. We could say, perhaps, that a perception or a sense of uncanniness waxes and wanes. It's definitely something which can depend on changes in social consciousness, in technological consciousness. And it's the technological that I wanted to pick up here, particularly the way in which moments of technological innovation cause a sense of uncanniness when the subject doesn't necessarily understand what's going on. And during the 19th century, you had a number of, as it were, you could say, kind of uncanny phenomena. For instance, the way in which people reacted to the sending of electric telegraph messages in 1858, which seemed, in a sense, to boggle the mind and to be completely incomprehensible. Whereas, quite soon afterwards, that technology was reasonably easily assimilable. The early screenings of cinema, again, caused people to kind of experience the sensation of the uncanny, not knowing what this illusion came from. Whereas, again, soon afterwards, the phenomenon cinema was one that was taken very much for granted. And I think my point here really is that is to emphasize the way in which the human mind is fascinated by a sense of uncertainty in front of new technological developments, and in some sense, as it were, almost enjoys pushing it further than it can might rationally do so. And one of the great examples of this is the appearance of the genre ghost photography in the late 19th century, when spiritualists were able to capture on celluloid the image of departed beloveds, and there, as it were, make the ghost appear on the celluloid image. And I think there was a sense that the technology of the camera was, as it were, strange enough that it was possible to believe that it was able to see what the human eye couldn't see, so that it could actually see the presence of ghosts, of invisible phenomena in the world that eluded us as the inadequate human eye. But then, of course, very soon afterwards, these ghost photographs were understood to be made by charlatans and by simple tricks of superimposition. And so once again, that kind of madness of the photograph, in Barthes' terms, gets domesticated again. And this sense of the uncanny, I think, can come to us today when we see digitally created images, especially photographs which have been digitally adapted, where suddenly standing in front of them, we don't know where the beginning and the end of the indexical referential presence of the object is. And it's this sense, new sense of uncanniness, this sense of sudden loss of certainty that I think is there now, and that has pushed me to look back to the presence of the uncanny in the indexical images of the past. And through this, in a sense, to end by trying to turn upside down the opposition between Lumiere and Melies that I suggested at the beginning. When people first saw the Lumiere films projected, what was most amazing to them were the incidental aspects of the image, not so much the presence of people moving. It was more the fact that the camera could capture in the film that we just saw the movement of the waves. In other films, the movement of leaves in the wind, the movement of cigar smoke rising, all these movements that were, in a sense, the movements of things that didn't necessarily have their own their own powers of self-projection. Their presence in the image was completely incidental. And Di Vaughan, writing about the Lumiere films, says that at the time that the animate should participate in self-projection was astonishing. What is different about a boat leaving the harbour is that when the boat is threatened by the waves, the men must apply their efforts to controlling it and respond to the challenge of the spontaneous movement. And by responding to the challenge of the spontaneous moment, they become integrated into its spontaneity. He says, a boat leaving the harbour begins without purpose and ends without conclusion, its actors drawn into the contingency of events. Successive viewings only serve to stress its pathetic brevity as a fragment of human experience. It serves as a reminder of that moment when the question of spontaneity was posed and had not yet been found to be insoluble. And he then goes on to argue, too, that the fall from grace of cinema was when the audience was no longer satisfied by this spontaneity, but needed fiction, in a sense, to amuse them further. Now, with Melies, we have another world, a world, sorry, lost my place, which, to my mind, is much more to do with a demystification of the process of cinema than actually absorption in its presence. And Paul Hammond has said of Melies, an object can be transformed either instantly or gradually into another, can grow or diminish. An object, usually a human, can disintegrate into parts, then these parts can assume a life of their own. An inanimate object can begin to move, and an animate one to defy the laws of gravity. An object can appear or disappear instantaneously or gradually. And he says not only statues come to life, but scarecrows, snowmen, dummies, skeletons, etc., etc. All his inanimate images pulsate with life through the camera's stop-motion capability. So while these themes definitely draw on the uncanny, on that uncertainty of barrier between animation and inanimation, the very flamboyance of Melies' technical skill draws attention to the fact that he's making magic. And he, in a sense, overtly harnessed the cinema in the interests of creating the fantastic. But because the effects are so clearly part of a mechanical device, he demystified the cinematic illusion. And once again, I think that with the passing of time, as we look back at Melies' magic, we see very clearly that he's playing with the mechanics of cinema itself and is there, in a sense, to expose the potential of cinema to our awe and to our wonder, and not, in a sense, to deceive us or allow us to believe for one single moment that this magic came from anywhere but a trick in the camera. And also, I think, looking back at the Lumiere film, what we feel, or perhaps what I feel, because I think I'll just speak for myself here, is this fascination with the once upon a time there-ness of the image, of the uncut piece of film that just lasts for that moment in which the actors are drawn into the contingency of events, as Di Vaughan says. And there, I think, with the Lumiere film, we can see something of the effect that has been argued for the still photograph there present in the moving image, in spite of the Barthes and the Barthes argument. And my final point, I just want to end with this, is really that how, as time goes past, will we actually begin to reevaluate fiction, cinema itself, literally almost as an effect of the passing of time. So now, even as what people call black and white films are shown over and over again on television, as the people who performed in them, as more or less, if we think of Hollywood films, more or less as themselves, rather than as masquerading as something else. There, that presence of the once upon a timeness of the celluloid indexical image begins to appear almost like a kind of tear or fracture in the fabric of the fiction, allowing us to see through that fabric and get that sense of the kind of ghostly presence which combines the index and the uncanny. Thank you for your patience. If anyone wants to say anything.
Does anyone have any questions?
Or I don't necessarily, I mean, questions, I think.
Points?
Yes. Observations.
I have a question about how you reconcile
Um, well, this is my kind of $64,000 question, really. This is my kind of speculative point where I'm ending rather with a dot, because I haven't really taken theory further or experimented with it. Part of the background, kind of backdrop to this, if I can just make it a little bit clearer as you asked, is that I think that we consume fiction films in a rather different way from how fiction was consumed when Barthes went to the cinema. I think more often now fiction is consumed fragmentarily. People watching their favorite films on video will replay a favorite moment over and over again, taking it out of fictional context. Fragments of fiction are kind of appropriated and recycled in different kinds of ways. There's an infinitely greater sense of sophistication about the fictional image. And in a sense, I suppose, paradoxically, it's out of that very sophistication that I'm arguing that the kind of tear, I'm kind of taking my terms from Hal Foster's Return of the Real. He probably takes it from somewhere else. But that kind of tear in the credibility of the fiction suddenly begins to emerge. So I'm thinking of this as more, or I'm trying to identify it perhaps as a contemporary phenomenon, not one that people would necessarily have wanted even to allow their imaginations to indulge in when they went and sat in a darkened cinema and the lights went down, the music came up, the projector started to work in the back of the cinema, and suddenly you were there in the magic world of cinematic fiction. That, I think, is a way of consuming movies that people do, but only as one among many other ways of consuming movies. And so, it's also a kind of spin-off from my argument that, in some sense, spectatorship itself can change. Spectatorship itself is in crisis and in evolution. As rather than, as it were, becoming fascinated by the fascination offered on the screen and becoming subject to its spectacle, the spectator's fascination can be, as it were, kind of allowing that to be shed like a snake might shed its skin, and suddenly seeing behind it the presence of the indexical moment, the moment of registration, which, of course, Bazin thought one should be conscious of in the films of Rossellini and his other favorite directors. So I'm making partly an argument of a shift in the way in which we perform spectatorship in this present changing moment. And I think also, I mean, just one last point. I mean, I think the other thing is that the human mind's actual kind of consciousness now of the fact that many of the images that they might see on the kind of large spectacular movies are illusions, but not illusions in the sense of Méliès kind of playing with the concept of an illusion, but an illusion which comes out of an image which has never ever once been. That, in a sense, gives a kind of preciousness, a value to this kind of rather creaky sense of the celluloid strip and the projector there as a kind of ghost behind the video image, which has now become so much more familiar. I mean, this is really what I want to think about, but but I can't get to that point without going through this long detour around the still image. So in a sense, what I'd like to do, if Mark would be kind enough to ask me back in about 5 years' time and see if I've got any further. Yeah. Oh, yes.
If you're talking about the narrative
But then if you're, I mean, I suppose the point in my argument, though, as I keep saying, my argument is kind of retrogressive one in a sense, is that with the digitally generated image, that sense of that has been is no longer there, because it hasn't ever once been actually there to be filmed. But what would be interesting would be to think of ways in which, if time is no longer registered in this way, how that affects space, and how one's perception of space might have to start to be reconfigured. But I haven't, I'm afraid, thought about that.